first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to make some observations around meeting the data needs for CCS going forward. So I'm going to take quite a broad approach, sharing some of the thoughts on the direction rather than necessarily a sort of a list of technologies. I think we're quite familiar with what technologies could be applied and which ones have been applied historically. So this is really a sort of a non-operator perspective, of course. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the pressures which are going to shape that technology selection, rather than necessarily advocating a specific technology as we go forward. So hopefully it will sort of promote a few discussions and things that we can get talking about. So you're all familiar with the standard legal notice, of course. But let's go into sort of more details on what I'll talk about. So the workshop itself is focused on European storage projects, but I think it is useful to take a first glance at a more global scale, what's been done elsewhere before getting into Europe. So we'll take a brief look there. I'll also outline some of the key sort of general parameters of CCS site selection, but really as they pertain to different monitoring strategies, and then go into more detail on the commercial landscape for CCS. I think that this commercial landscape, geophysical industry, and what technology drivers have existed in the past is something important to have a discussion around. And then I'll conclude with some comments on sort of specific seismic technology and summarizing that. So really, what I hope that people will take away from this is some thoughts on how the application of technology, sort of monitoring technologies for CCS may differ a little bit from oil and gas, and we've heard a little bit about some of the differences in the previous talks, but due to both technical reasons and commercial reasons to go, and then of course what some of those commercial reasons actually are. So I don't think any CCS presentation is complete necessarily without an IEA policy in there. So just to talk to that for a moment, there was a recent announcement, and I'm sure people are aware of it. If you go into some of the details in that, then there is a statement within the IEA, and it's saying that any net zero scenario, any lower carbon scenario is very unlikely without the application of CCS. So CCS is something that should have a growing future going forward. So first of all, if we'll focus in on the European sites, but start first with this sort of global overview. And what you're seeing here is CO2 emissions from power generation on a global scale. So they're the orange circles, the magnitude of CO2 being generated. Now, obviously CO2 comes from a variety of other sources as well, such as cement and steel, but these are often co-located, of course, because of the power requirements. So as a way of looking at these things geographically, this I think is quite effective. If you look at the purple diamonds in there, they're CCS R&D sites, with the green diamonds being sort of commercially operating CCS in one form or another, whether that be pure CCS or some of those examples will be enhanced oil recovery items as well. And if you go to a step further in terms of stated CCS sites happening around the world, then by far the largest are in Europe. So it's a good focus to look to see what's happening in Europe, and where those will take us in terms of those monitoring technologies. But there are a few sites that deserve a good mention quite early on. We've heard obviously today about Sleipner and Snøhvit, so I won't go into any detail on that one, but suffice to sort of mention a couple of other key facilities around the world. So one being the Quest facility in Canada. It's been operating for 5 years of injection, and they have also published a lot of work talking about monitoring strategies and what they've done. And so I think that's a great source of information. Likewise, the CO2 CRC facility in the Otway Basin in Australia is also another great example of sort of a rigorous monitoring program where they then talk about and publish information on the technologies, the pros and cons, and how they've been used. So really just to draw attention to those items. Ccs Licensing Evolution. Now we've just heard some fairly hot off the presses changes in the talk previous to this. So I'll run through this really to illustrate that acreage is being awarded, even though there are still some regulatory questions sitting out there in the future that still need to be answered around handovers, responsibilities as and where they lie. But back in 2018, PelbyDOT, which runs the Acorn site in the White Firth, that was the first CO2 appraisal and storage license issued in the UK. 2019, Equinor, alongside their partners at the time, Shell and Total, granted the exploitation permit in Norway. And then in 2020, E&I was awarded a license in the Irish Sea, just to the west of Britain, and the Northern Endurance Partnership was formed. Obviously, all of these elements have longer history than that, but this is what is appearing out in the news. So you start to see this sort of gathering momentum. And then we've seen this year, I think, 3 further licenses have been applied for in the UK Southern North Sea. So these are things which are accelerating in acreage awards and so on. So in terms of site characteristics and monitoring, it's a relatively sparse slide in here, but I think most people are sort of aware of the level of complexity that this can go to. My point here is that on the terms of the storage site, I think essentially what we're looking for is the most geologically simple site possible, and consequently something that is likely to be at least more easily monitored. And certainly some of the risking that has been talked around the Shell Quest site was around eliminating a whole series of risks by picking somewhere that was geologically relatively simple. And then that has a knock-on effect, hopefully, in terms of the cost effectiveness of the monitoring situation, and also, of course, the risks that operators are exposed to as well. So yeah, the monitoring requirement is really around the application of technologies to demonstrate containment and conformance. So containment of CO2 within the reservoir, conformance with models and so on, as we know. And they will be sort of planned and reactive in nature. At the moment, and I hope I'm not doing a disservice here, but you know, at the moment it seems that as far as CCS is concerned, despite, you know, in some cases decades of experience, when it comes to sort of CCS for sort of long-term storage driven purely by a lower carbon world, then we're in this sort of first of a kind mode. And as we move away, and it's touched on a little bit earlier, but as we move away from these very comprehensive first of a kind sites like Quest and Sleipner and Otway, I think the focus will be on utilizing as fewer technologies as possible. So not necessarily a need for multiple corroborating technologies. And that, to me, points primarily towards seismic technology as being the primary data source for what will be used in monitoring. If we take a look at the what's happening in the North Sea, I won't go into a huge amount of detail on these ones, but the carbon storage estimates, and hopefully these numbers are reasonably up to date. They are from published sources, of course, and sometimes those numbers will change. But you've got your injection estimates in there, but you've got 1,500 million tons of CO2 being emitted in Europe. And so that's the sort of the size or the magnitude of what will happen, and therefore the potential for expansion. I think one size doesn't fit all, so all the monitoring regulations will have to be sort of flexibly developed, and so there will be different monitoring solutions for each of these sites relating to the geology. And as Anna-Kari said before, then this is something of a risk-based approach to technology selection and what you're going to do. To highlight a couple of differences in here, so for the Acorn site, for example, you have quite well understood reservoir. It's the Kopervik sands, so it's depleted fields, you have legacy wells, and the challenges that go with the copper exams where they are at the moment. Northern Lights and Northern Endurance, potentially quite sort of spatially large areas in this sort of hub and spoke development scenario. And I would imagine that will play a role in technology selection when it comes to it. But there are others on this call more intimately knowledgeable about that certainly than I am. If you look at Greensand and Porthos, yeah, these are sort of older depleted fields, smaller volumes, and likely again a different monitoring scenario for each one of these programs. So I think a key point here is that these are long-term programs. It's indicating a sort of a life of field plan, and there's some uncertainty on how CCS will develop over the next few years in terms of what those monitoring solutions need to be. So I would like to talk a little bit about the commerciality of CCS and monitoring. I think it relates to how technology will be selected. So we will look sort of first on the upstream side. So this is on the supply side for CO2, and it's a very different situation depending on what kind of business you're in. Whether you're it's quite complex, depends on a variety of factors. So if you look at the first of a kind, and this is from a report from the Global CCS Institute, then you'll see that relating to the key cost data, you've got 2 to 5% increase where you're capturing CO2 from natural gas power or bioethanol. When you go up to power generation and cement, this can be a significant impactor on the cost of capture in the first place, which speaks to how that supply will develop over time, and therefore how CCS sites will develop as well. There is value, of course, in the cost or not paying the cost of CO2 by avoiding emitting it in the first place, and that represents a series of savings to those operators. But it speaks to the complexity of how this will develop, with CCS being very much on the sort of almost downstream side of these sort of activities. So a word on technology. So what you're looking at here is a sort of diagram we've presented a few times. So the graph there is oil price going from the mid 80s all the way up until the present day, and then you can see the schematics for the streamer acquisition as being the technology that has developed or at least been applied at each one of those times relative to the oil price. So really the main point here is the application of technology, or the technology available, is really directly linked to the commerciality or the size of the prize. So as that oil price goes higher, different technologies are brought to bear. A number of these technologies and sort of operational models have been developed for quite specific geological or commercial challenges. And I won't go through all the individual technologies that fit into this, but you see one that probably most people know in topsides, and the application of why that has been developed. And each one of these has a cost associated with it. So many of the advanced seismic technologies of today, really they've been applied or committed to in a much higher oil price environment. Conversely, the value proposition of CO2 storage, effectively a waste management, really needs to represent quite a different value proposition. So the full suite of technologies, even before the highs of the 2010s, need to be looked at through quite different targets, potentially simpler targets than we've had previously, or at least in recent years. And they have a need to be low cost, potentially a 4D requirement. I think really the good news here is that as a geophysical industry, we've never been in a better position in terms of the diverse array of technologies that we have to address any of the subsurface challenges that we have. So with that on some of the drivers behind technology development, then when it comes to technologies that will be used for monitoring, and this has an impact, I think, on where technologies, whether they be sort of operational or processing, needs to be developed or changed specifically for CCS, then what you're seeing here is the value of CO2. It's rising. This is from the the EU ETS, which is a cap and trade system. But does the business of CO2 support the development of newer technologies, or to what extent does it, beyond government support and government drivers? So a little bit on the EU ETS, it's a cap and trade system. So it's set on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions from various installations, whether that be power generation, cement or steel and so on. And then companies trade to either receive, buy emissions allowances. And the total number of allowances is limited in itself. So as those allowances are reduced over the years, then you come into a position where the price rises and the business continues and grows goes from that point. We just flipped on to the other slide here. So really, as with any really with any kind of seismic program or geophysical program, then it's getting that right balance in the right place, which is the most important thing. You want to be in that sort of target zone where you're not failing on the cost and time, but you also don't want to fail on the technology either. So to summarize on that one, then many of the existing 4D technologies are available, but the unit cost of any given technology needs to be balanced with the value of the product, in this case storage, and then what are the monitoring requirements that go into that. So I think those are some of the key messages from that side on the commercial. So to talk a little bit on a specific topic, one that we're looking more and more into, and that's the CCS monitoring with DAS technology, and we've heard a little bit about potential applications of that during the course of the presentations today. But we look at DAS, the permanent monitoring element of it. So these systems, these fiber optic cable systems, can be used to monitor reservoirs for several different properties, including seismic imaging, but also temperature, flow, and so on. And they're installed within the wellbores, and that can make it quite an attractive way to do the monitoring process. 3D VSP, so once you install one of these fiber optic systems and they can sit there 20, 25 years, then you have quite a rapid turnaround time for any VSP work and overall a reduction in cost. So it has potential to provide a higher resolution 3D images, and you can start to look at, obviously, with multiple wells in that DAS system. And then for the 4D requirement, then you do have that flexibility and the capability with those kind of systems. And I think that really to look at the different technologies and see what they're providing in terms of cost, coverage, resolution, and repeatability, that if the image that you're getting of the subsurface, the resolution is there, the repeatability is there, DAS is limited compared to other technologies when it comes to coverage. That's for sure. But depending on how big those plumes are, the monitoring plans and so on, then this is a technology that could turn out to be very cost effective and very useful to use for CCS monitoring. And it may be done in combination with other more conventional technologies on the seismic side as well. So I think with a little discussion on a specific technology there, move to the summary and wrap up here. But yeah, the regulatory framework, those commercial incentives, they really need to address the whole integrated CCS value chain, and that goes from the supplier of the CO2 to the operator of the storage site to the service provider who's going to provide some of those monitoring solutions. And that's, I think, it's particularly if new, more efficient technologies need to be developed to meet those monitoring requirements. I think that's a little bit different to how the seismic development has happened for oil and gas, because the same commercial drivers are not present. There will be different commercial drivers in there. The point mentioned before, the application of technology or the technology available is really directly linked to the commerciality of the business that you're in, or the prize, as we might say, for oil and gas, which is very similar to oil and gas, but it's quite notable that CCS is yet to be on a fully commercial scale and still requires significant government support and government financial drivers to go with it. And then the final point there, to demonstrate containment and conformance robustly with the most efficient but minimized monitoring technology. So the minimum number of technologies to be selected in order to provide a robust monitoring solution. So really to wrap up on that one, what I would probably hope that people take away from this is, as I said in the beginning, is a few thoughts on how the application of technology for CCS may differ slightly from oil and gas. And that can be due to obviously technical elements, but also for commercial reasons. And that's something that is useful to explore in how we deal with technology when it comes to sort of the road ahead for monitoring of CCS projects. So I hope that's been interesting and sort of prompts a few thoughts or questions. But with that, I will say thank you for listening.
Thank you, Will.
My question actually was triggered after listening Mrs. Eva Helen. And so at the time we need to support our studies and go to, to comply with the regulations. So I was thinking about, about capacity, storage capacity. So SPE, well, probably you are well familiar with the reserves. When we do reserves and resources estimations, so we use systems like PRMS, Petroleum Resource Management System. And there is one recently from 2017, also supported by the SPE and the APG, which is for CO2 storage, similarly to the PRMS. So I'm wondering, I know regulations in Norway are from 2014, so probably you haven't been used that, but I'm really curious about in the industry right now, that kind of system is coming to be more common use, and it's very, well spread now than CO2 has a price now. It's a commodity pretty much.
I can just confirm that we did not use the SRMS system, which is the CO2 part of or the part of the PRMS, because that was not ready when we did our evaluation in 2014. But you are perfectly right. It's there has been a lot of testing of it. The group that worked with it has tried it out on different storage sites and evaluation, and I see this come more and more for development of CO2 storage sites. So we haven't done that evaluation, but we are looking in maybe testing it on some of the reservoirs. But we see that that's coming.
Yeah, I would say that we are for net zero Teesside, we are using that system.
Yeah.
So it is, yeah, it is around while using it.
It is. So was that answer?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
There is another question for you, Eva, from Cedric Payamendi. Thank you for your presentation. CO2 storage is a relatively new business area, attracting new, not necessarily oil-related companies. Could you please comment on the qualification of these companies? Will these only be a business for oil companies which have experience with subsurface characterization and monitoring, drilling, subsea, etc.?
Thank you for the question, and that is a question I can promise we get several times that question. And we are in the startup of developing the CO2 storage industry in Norway. We start up with the Northern Light project. And what we say today is that the company who are going to drill a well offshore Norway need to have an experience on that and need to have an competence in the geology offshore Norway. And the reason is that everywhere where you drill a well offshore Norway, you can meet hydrocarbons. So we need a company who has experience on that.
There's another question from Paul Wire. What is the expected minimum magnitude of detection for microseismicity from the arrays that you showed?
May I add a comment to that? Would it be okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so the rule of thumb that I use from our experiments on this is 10 to the m. So whatever the magnitude is, we use 10 to the m kilometers. So for a magnitude 1 event, 10 to the m is 10, so that means 10 kilometers. It means you need 3 stations to locate a magnitude 1 event closer than about 10 kilometers. And so you can use that rule of thumb pretty well for lots of things to calculate what magnitude events you can locate.
So there were some comments about public assurance, and that made me remember a paper that David, you published some years ago, in which you talk about public acceptance and that being a problem. Especially you mentioned in that paper that not in my backyard. Like, I'm all for CO2 storage as long as it is not in my backyard. So I would like to listen to your opinion about that, and also Will, from a more general perspective, and perhaps some opinions about that perspective from Norway. Would you start, David?
Yes, sure, Adriana. No, this is great. And I actually think it's one of the biggest challenges to CCS is the social license. And probably that's the reason why most of it will move offshore or out of sight.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, in my experience, particularly with the land projects, even when we had in the early phase, we do a lot of education, public outreach, have monthly, workshops with the community and so forth to educate them about CCS and et cetera, about everything, monitoring techniques and seismicity and so forth. There, even when you get initial social license, maybe to start doing the first phases of the project, as the project continues into the commercial phase, people get more and more concerned, and it's in unpredictable ways. It's a little like the stock market, right? What drives the stock market? There's a lot of speculation about what people are thinking. And so that's why the continuous outreach and education, I think, is important. So we have seen CCS projects lost or abandoned midstream because of this social license issue. And it's things like, well, could this plume be propagating under my farmland, and will it affect my crops or animals? Or will it affect my real estate price? I have a farm that's worth $1 million today, but will anybody want to buy my farm in the future if they know there's a CO2 plume? Things like this. And also coming back to monitor all the time. For a few years, people are happy, and often there's some payments for people to come and monitor, access their land and monitor. But, after maybe 5 years of doing that, they don't want you maybe keep coming back for 20, 50, 100 years or something. And so I think this social license thing is a huge issue unless it's out of sight and out of mind, like far offshore or other places. Yeah.
Thank you. Will, do you want to comment on that topic? You're muted, though.
Sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. A very similar question came up not so long ago in another session, and I think it's important that we've all heard of greenwashing, and that is an important topic to get into. But then also, on the other side, you've got brownwashing of different technologies, and CCS is one of those. And there are lobby groups who would effectively brownwash CCS and argue that it is a case of oil and gas companies trying to prolong the hydrocarbon business rather than focusing on what CCS is actually delivering, both in terms of hydrocarbons, but also for CO2 sequestration from cement and steel. And, you know, I think potentially there's an analogy there with the nuclear industry and how they have been impacted by lobby groups as well. So again, it is a communication challenge for when it comes to winning that social license, because I feel like it has to be won rather than assumed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was saying, like, I think it's very difficult because, you know, I think when we had discussions on this, I had discussions in other groups on this, is most people don't know anything about earth science. They don't know much about geology or geophysics. They don't really, when they think you're putting it underground, they think it's sort of just down there. They have no idea of the scales, that it's like a kilometer down, you know, there's, and that's sort of the tough thing, is that there's actually not very good, I mean, most people don't have much education in geology. And so that lack of background knowledge is always going to be a problem to overcome.
Yeah, I agree. And perhaps it's also, I mean, the connection with the oil and gas industry as well was pointing out as well, that unfortunately our reputation is very biased, not really based on technology that we use or safety standards, etc.
Just add on a similar line. I've sort of found that different countries, or you know, people in different countries have different relationships with the oil and gas industry, right? So I found much more awareness in Norway of the offshore industry and oil and gas than I do in the UK, for instance. And you know, certainly in areas like Houston. So you actually have quite a different perception of the role of energy and oil and gas and how that works within a society, depending on, you know, which country that you actually live in.
Perhaps that also maps where most of these projects are happening, especially the large scale projects. A regular theme in this workshop, even though the other 2 days we didn't, because the themes were different, but it has been a regular theme. What can we do about the economics of these projects? What can the government do? Is the tax system helping? Is subsidies helping? How long will they stay? And perhaps, Eva, you can comment a little bit on that. I know Norway last year changed the tax for CO2 emissions in offshore oil and gas, and that actually helps the economics, I guess. But could you comment a little bit more on this topic?
Yeah, we have had a CO2 tax in the petroleum industry since 1991. It started, and it has gradually increased. So guess that was one of the taxes. That the tax will be further. Up to now, it's a very different tax regime for CO2 storage than it is for petroleum storage, and it's not the company has to pay everything for the well, for drilling a well, which in the petroleum industry is very reduced. The state take a lot of the cost and get it back when the production starts. So I think to say it the easy way, yeah, it costs money to do CO2 storage. No one has challenged the tax system for CO2 storage yet, and I expect that will come. I think what maybe it's not the right time exactly now, because the state has put a lot of money into the the Longship project, the Northern Light, and that's some billion Norwegian kroner. So, but that's the one way that the Norwegian state and the government want to support the development of the CCS industry in Norway. So they take the most of the cost, around 80% of the cost for the Longship. project. And but the next phase is what we see a lot of several companies start interested in doing CO2 storage offshore Norway, other companies, and they are struggling with the cost. So I think there will be some challenge on that.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you.
And just on the subject of cost of monitoring, I had a question for Will, actually. So I was just wondering what you see as sort of the technology drivers that could reduce 4D costs. And I guess I was wondering on, you know, I guess I'm always looking at more from the acquisition side, and I was wondering if from the processing side, if there's also, you know, that you could get, you know, because I was always thinking, oh, you want more dense data, but maybe you don't need dense data. Maybe there's things you see coming from the technology on the processing side or analysis side that will allow you to get sort of cheaper, more sparsely sampled data to give you such a similar result.
Yeah, I think on the what we've noticed, if I sort of frame it like this, well, what we've noticed over recent years is that actually our ability to acquire data in terms of the amount of samples and the volume of data that we can acquire in an operational phase is sort of outstripping the compute. So we often talk about compute doubling in very short intervals, but in actual fact, the amount of data that we can acquire is somewhat outstripping that, which is where things become very computationally expensive. And that's part of the challenge on the processing side. I think it's a part of a little bit of what I was sort of trying to frame earlier with the sort of with oil price, the development of acquisition technologies and the increase in density of data and so on. And that when it comes to CCS monitoring and ability to image CO2 in the subsurface, then a simpler technology, less dense sampling, and therefore less computationally expensive processing, coupled with other technologies in AI and so on, that are developing are probably going to chart the way forwards for what we want to do. Certainly with things like DAS, the ability to sort of image within a few kilometers and potentially as well expand that out to several kilometers through processing developments is something that I think we see as being sort of key to getting us on the road to more cost-effective monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, definitely anything you can do to push out your first, you know, the time when you have to start doing your 4D repeats. So the bigger you can get your DAS sampling, you know, yeah, the more efficient things are going to be.
So I saw there are a couple of, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna add to that, and it's sort of really in the sort of the spirit of collaboration of looking at some of these challenges. And yeah, we have started working with Halliburton on DAS and trying to develop that technology. And I think that there are probably other opportunities for collaboration sort of more closely and on the vendor side for finding cost savings, efficiencies, and so on. And that I think will remain an important part. The sort of ability as operators have created joint ventures for CCS, then you know, joint ventures and collaborations on the vendor side will also deliver efficiencies and savings in that space too.
If the general public gives a social license to bury household waste a few meters below ground, where it decomposes and emits methane, then is it reasonable to expect them to grant a social license to bury CO2 more than 800 meters below the surface?
Well, that's back to our social license discussion, I think, and it's you know, public opinion on these things is sometimes logical and sometimes not logical. And so I think the classic example is Groningen, right? Groningen, the gas field in the Netherlands. So it's been producing gas by Shell since 1960 or so. And the town above it, that sits above that giant gas reservoir, had no problem with it for decades, really. until Shell proposed taking some of the CO2 and injecting it back into the earth. And then nobody wanted that, and they shut down the CO2 project, but they're living on top of a giant gas reservoir. Methane is toxic, it's explosive, and everything else. So these things are sometimes not logical. And I guess the questioner was asking about waste disposal, garbage disposal. Everybody knows that garbage has to go somewhere, but nobody wants it in their backyard or etc. So the US is a type of environment where they always want the operator to be responsible forever. In general, they don't. So US, you know, in general, has less government, tries to have less government involvement in things, in industry. So for that reason, I think it will take a long time, as far as I'm aware, before, I mean, there's no provision for handover for that reason. They don't want something to be handed over from an operator to the government, and then for whatever reason, maybe they don't trust the government to monitor it properly in the US. I can't comment on all the reasons, but so there's no handover, and I don't know of any progress on that front. And then so those long periods, 50 to 100 years, and in 100 years, that's California low carbon fuel standards. And, you know, California has very, very strict environmental regulations and standards on all kinds of things, the most strict in the country, in the US. And so that's just for the post-injection period, but there's no handover. So, you know, I think, and as part of the low carbon fuel standard, which applies to a whole bunch of other things too. So they're definitely setting the most extreme boundary, and I don't see any progress that's going to be reduced. They do have a provision, I should say, and I think Ava mentioned this too. There is always a provision that if you can establish to somebody, a regulatory authority, that you're doing your close the loop studies, and that's something we need, I think, some more research on to show how good we are at that. But, you know, if we can show everything matches our flow simulations, you know, with our detailed reservoir characterization, all this overkill study that Anna Corey rightly pointed out is maybe going, using a gold standard for something that's maybe not as dangerous as people think. But if we can show that, and an operator could show that for, let's say, a decade, I'm trying to think back to the low carbon fuel standard, what that time period is, and if there's an exception. There definitely is one in the US EPA rules, that if you can go, I think it might be 20 years, if you can show conformance by detailed closed loop study, and everything's matching, all your MMV is matching what the models are saying and so forth, at that point, you can apply for permission to discontinue monitoring, or at least go to very, very infrequent monitoring. So there is it's not a hard requirement that you monitor for 50 years or 100 years. But I think nobody has really tested that yet to see, could you, you know, show in a close the loop study everything's working perfectly, and then apply for permission to stop monitoring and receive permission? And I think I'm not aware of that. Maybe anywhere in the world, but maybe Ava or somebody else knows of a case.
Thank you for the answer.
No, I think I'm not familiar with any cases on that, and maybe the industry is too new in many places, and so in 20, 30 years, maybe 40, 50 years, maybe we are able to test it and see if it works.
and I might add, at least in the US and other places, this is slowing down the adoption of commercial CCS because the operator doesn't want to be responsible forever. Or put it this way, it changes the business model a lot. You know, if in one place you're responsible forever, and in another place you hand it over after 30 years or whatever it might be, it changes the business model a lot. And in fact, the last mega project I work on in West Australia, we spent the last 10 years proving up this certain place in Western Australia. It's stuck right now because the business community, which in this case the CO2 sources are coal-fired power plants and mineral processing plants and other things that generate CO2. It's now their turn to do the next stage, the commercial stage of the project, to build the pipeline to collect the CO2, build a set of injectors and so forth. They don't want to go forward because the regulatory environment there is not exactly known enough to have a long-term business model.
I can just add to that, David. In Norway, we say after shutdown, the operator have to monitor, responsible for monitoring up to 20 years. But if they can show that it behaves like they expected it to behave, then they can apply much earlier. And I think for Netherlands, for their first application for a license, I think it was around 7 years they got, and I think for the Golden Eye was around the same, 5 to 7 years. Yeah. So it has been tested in that way, but it all would depend on what happened and how conform one is, the government and also the companies are with the injection.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, well, it's something. So within the UK right now, the government are sort of finalizing the business commercial models for CCUS. They're meant to be released by November, hopefully before. But obviously a big part of that discussion is like, what is going to be, like, what is the requirement? When can you hand over? Because that liability, and also what is the liability? Do you have to make a fund? You know, do you have to have like a contingency fund? How big does that contingency fund have to be? You know, there's a lot of negotiations, I think, going on. There were discussions about how it should look, you know, to sort of be able to encourage it to happen, because, you know, all the European governments really, I mean, their goals are really, really huge, right? So they're saying they need like millions and millions and millions of tons of CO2 storage as soon as possible. So they need to make it, you know, they need to sort of start this going by allowing companies to not be too scared.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions about passive monitoring. So one of them is passive monitoring important in post-injection? Is Junson Park, he's commenting that he thought it is more for during injection than post-injection, because during injection pressure builds up and post-injection pressure is supposed to decrease. Any taker?
I think, yeah, was that addressed to me? Yeah, so yeah. I can start, and that is the first thing I think it's important to know is that there's a big difference between CO2 injection and water injection. So water injection is an almost incompressible fluid. CO2 in supercritical form is an extremely compressible fluid, and so that means when you inject it, you know, it changes its volume rather than push the water as hard. So the amount of induced seismicity we expect to see in CO2, and in fact that we have seen in CO2 injection project, is orders of magnitudes less than say wastewater injection wells. So that's the first comment. So of course the public is very excited about all the induced seismicity in places where there's a lot of wastewater injection, and Oklahoma probably is now the most famous case of this, including felt events. So is CO2 injection, we don't see very many felt events at all. And in a lot of cases, we can barely detect microseismic events. Now, I just showed a slide where there's 90,000 10,000 events per year for a commercial scale CCS project, but they're all less than about magnitude 1. And it's because CO2 is so compressible. So that's the first thing. The next thing about post-injection, which I think the question was asking about, we know from a lot of experience in earthquake seismology that when an earthquake happens, whether it's a microseismic event or a felt event, of course it releases stress. That's what causes the earthquake. And that stress release takes time to propagate through the system. So even if we shut off the source of injection, the source of the pressure front, it takes time, often months or years, for that pressure front to diffuse. It still continues propagating. So do the fluids. We know that from petroleum engineers, know that very well. If you have an injector or a producer and you shut it off, things just don't stop instantaneously. Fluids keep moving for quite some time, and it varies depending on the complexity of your reservoir properties. So we see that microseismic events, or let's say induced seismicity, which is triggered by stress front propagation above critical stress, triggering these events, we see it continue on for weeks, months, and sometimes years. So there is a point to monitoring seismicity post-injection. The other thing is, as I showed with the ambient seismic noise, is we have within our reach ability to image the plume and image a pressure front from ambient seismic noise. And there's lots of ways. I only showed one example, but there's actually several ways we could do it. And that's part of the objective of the post-injection monitoring, is to make sure the plume is, well, we've also seen the plume continues to propagate after CO2 injection. We have seen cases of that. And we want to watch and see when it stabilizes, and then see maybe the CO2 starts converting phases and getting locked up, dissolving in the fluid and mineralization and so forth. We would like to see that happen, all those things in terms of storage happen post-injection. And so we need to be able to monitor post-injection. And so we can use the ambient noise side of passive seismic to do some of that imaging. And in some cases on a very sparse case, that I won't bring it up again, but that slide, the example I showed in California for groundwater, that's over an area, a large area with only a few dozen stations, so very, very sparse, like a 5-kilometer spacing, stations, a few dozen stations. You can make a map, a crude, but low resolution smooth map of the change in things on an area that might be on the order of 100 square kilometers. So, getting back to this, we don't necessarily need post-injection. We don't necessarily need to monitor at very, very high resolutions like we do during injection, where we got a lot more transients going on.
Thank you, David. Does anybody want to comment about, we actually have another comment about passive. So from Paul Wire, it's more of a comment than a question. Arguably, a stronger history of passive seismic monitoring of offshore oil and gas could have helped with both the mitigation and the public engagement when induced seismicity emerged onshore. routine passive seismic monitoring could avert a similar situation for CCS?
The risk now is post-fracking, basically. It's much trickier. Like, I guess if we had been able to show before any of the sort of fracking stuff started, look, there is background seismicity everywhere. You do things.
Yeah.
The earthquakes are tiny. It's been happening for 50 years. Look, there's been no big problems. But the problem is now that there's such a vocal group against the fracking industry, I think it's very dangerous to link, because then the risk, I think we had a lot of discussions at the start of the project, like with linking CO2 injection with fracking, and you want to make sure that the two never meet, because of the difficulties there.
Yeah.
Even
Perhaps
if we
as well,
know that if fracking is done correctly, it's not actually a risk, because we know about it, but for the average person, that's not the case. So that's what I just wanted to say about that.
I mean, I have some thoughts on this too, and one is I agree. There's seismicity going on continuously. It's just very, very weak. So, and using that rule of thumb I mentioned before, if you look at the national earthquake station arrays, they typically have a spacing on the order of a couple of 100 kilometers. That means they have what's called a magnitude of completeness of 3 or just less than 3. That means they can only reliably detect earthquakes and locate them magnitude about 3. So that means, and we know that there are 10 times more earthquakes at magnitude 2 than magnitude 3, and so forth. It's logarithmic. So this has been going on all the time. It's just we haven't been measuring it because we don't have enough sensors out. And so that's one of the first things that we're interested in the CCS project is what is, as I think Roy and Anna Curry mentioned for their project, what is the natural baseline seismicity? And let's go out and measure it. And of course, any array, each array has its own magnitude of completeness. And so I couldn't tell what the spacing was there, but we build sort of nested arrays that have different, so 10 kilometer spacing and 1 kilometer spacing. So we can essentially record seismicity down to background seismicity down to magnitude 1 or so, maybe a little bit less. Anyway, it's been going on all the time. So just like 4D seismic, we never knew all this stuff was happening until we started looking for it, right, and trying to measure it. It's the same with the seismicity. So I think, you know, the only reason that onshore we seem to be, the public is more aware of this is because of massive water injection, and it's associated often with, it's not actually usually not the fracking itself, because that's a small amount of water. It's the water disposal wells related to all that production, it's particularly shale production. And so it's that massive amount of water that's being injected. Now we know offshore, we have massive water injectors too. And in 4D seismic, we sometimes see what we call out of zone injection. So we know that water is not always staying in where we're injecting it. And it's probably creating lots of microseismic events and maybe even some felt events. It's just that we don't have enough sensors out there continuously recording to detect them. So yeah, I agree with the other comments. It's just a fact of nature that seismicity is going all the time, and it's the level of it varies from place to place depending on stress conditions and faults and so forth, but it's always going on. And so that's an important part of any project, I think, going forward, that we've sort of come to realize over the past 20 years or so, maybe, especially the last 10 years, is that, oh, we should go out and deploy arrays to try to measure this natural seismicity and then compare it to the seismicity of our operations. But that takes, you know, money and time and effort deploying those arrays and so forth.
Well, I would like to thank you all. It has been a very interesting discussion, and I just realized that we have actually run 15 minutes over. So it means that we were having a good chat, and that's I'm very pleased with that. So thank you so much for your participation and for your excellent talks and contributions. I think this is the end of our workshop. So yeah, Laurie, is there any last words that you would like to share, or should we just say goodbye?
Yeah, I guess I have a few words. First of all, thanks to all of our presenters, all 3 days. All 3 days were full of excellent presentations. And all 3 days we had excellent questions from the audience. So thank everyone for attending, and thank all of the committee members for putting this all together. So thank you very much. That's
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.